Perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Abida Minhas. I'm a licensed professional counselor from Dallas, Texas. I'm a mental health director for AMHP, American Muslim Health Professionals. We are founded on the basis that we are a nonprofit organization that hosts interfaith dialogues like today's. And one of the things that I'm honored and privileged to be able to talk about and host is a wonderful panel of 4 faith community leaders from multicultural backgrounds that will be hosting and joining us today to give us some of their experiences and expertise with the multicultural interfaith work that they do in their communities, as well as the work that they are doing with within their own circles to help us with this pandemic. One of the things we're hosting today and talking about is coping and dealing with loss and grief, and how all of us coming from multicultural communities, and of course, being human beings from having to go through different circumstances in this pandemic, all of us are grieving very differently. And we want to be able to provide a lot of those expertise and experiences that our wonderful panelists will be sharing with us today to be able to help others that are having struggles within their own circles. So it's my great honor and privilege to be able to, first of all, introduce Rabbi Moshe Hauser. And Dr. Hauser and Rabbi Hauser, a lot of the work that Dr. Hauser is doing is he's working as an executive vice president in his community, heading in a communal-oriented efforts and serving professional religious policy leader. And he's also a primary spokesperson. Prior to joining the OU, the Orthodox Union, for his community, Dr. Hauser and Rabbi Hauser, served as a senior to where he was active in the local communal leadership in his area. Rabbi Hauser, what I also learned about you is you received a Master's of Science from Johns Hopkins University, which is also a great honor, I'm sure, and something I imagine that you may also do as a teacher. So it's my great honor and privilege to introduce you today. We're also joined here today by Don, or Dr. Salvador Torvin. I was told that you don't prefer the title doctor, so I'll start with Don. Salvador Torvin. He teaches professional psychology and lectures extensively in California. One of the things that Dr. or Don Trevino is active is furthering national conversation and cultural diversity, enriching different multicultural communities. Don Trevino is also executive director for GCAPS. He's a licensed psychologist working in a university in Santa Barbara in California. And I am welcoming today also Dr. Trevino, or Don Trevino, and I appreciate your time as well today. And we will give you some time to be able to talk about some of your own cultural experiences shortly as well. Lastly, we have Dr. Reverend Leslie Copeland Toon. Dr. Toon is also working in gospel ministries for the last 20 years. Dr. Leslie Copeland Toon has worked in a number of faith-based organizations. We welcome you today, Dr. Toon. Dr. Toon also is served as a director of the Poverty Initiative and Anti-Poverty Ministry, which also gives a lot of voices to collective actions to end poverty in multicultural communities. So we welcome you, Dr. Toon, as well today. Rabbi Moshe, we'll start with you to give us some background on the expertise and experiences that you have, to be able to provide us some ways that your community members have dealt with the pandemic and how they deal with their grief and loss.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to participate here. My name is Moshe Hauer. I have the privilege, indeed, of serving in the leadership of the Orthodox Union, the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America. It's a privilege to be together in this faith discussion about how each of us, as individuals, as religious participants and religious leaders and religious communities, have deal with grief. There's the unique flavor, of course, of the pandemic grief, where grief has been so widespread. Grief, of course, encompasses many things, most basically loss of life, but grief is experienced over any kind of a loss. What I would like to share with you is the traditional Jewish approach to grief, the practices that are involved, that perhaps provide a good framing for where people can find comfort. I'm sure that we will hear from our other distinguished panelists who will speak from their faith traditions, and I'm sure there will be a lot of overlap. It's my privilege to share a little bit of how the Jewish tradition deals with this. Many of you may be familiar with the Hebrew term Shiva. Shiva is actually a number. Shiva means 7. And the traditional observance of grief in Jewish life, according to Jewish law, is that after someone buries someone dear to them, one of their immediate relatives, they go into a 7-day period of mourning. A week. During that week, they stay at home. They don't go out and about to do their business. And they have many visitors. Typically, hopefully a person, one of the specialties of all of our religious communities is that we provide each other with community. And we see each other in the house of faith. And when someone is struggling through something, we try to be there for them so they don't struggle alone. And we visit with them. And some could look at it from the outside and wonder, kind of like an odd experience. The person has just experienced loss. Maybe we should leave them alone. Instead, they have a parade of visitors, sometimes from early in the morning to late at night. In our tradition, we have prayer services that take place, the regular prayer services. Many people move them from the synagogue to pray in the house of the mourners. And they spend the days talking to people, speaking to people, and speaking to people really ideally about their loss. Of course, religious people are human beings too. Sometimes conversations veer from the discussion of the loss. Maybe it appears a little bit more social at times, but fundamentally, we always try to bring it back to speak about the loss, to speak about what is being missed. It's a period of community, and it's a period of focus. And I want to share the perspective that we have in our faith, not in an academic sense, but in an experiential sense about how this works. And let's focus on those two parts, the part of the visitors, of the company, and secondly, on the conversation, and the gifts that each of those provide. There's a verse in the Bible, there's a verse in the book of Deuteronomy in the Torah that warns us against expressing excessive grief, tearing into the flesh. Don't do that, the Torah tells us, the Bible tells us. And it says, you are children to the Lord your God. Banim atem Hashem Elokechem. Lo titgodedu, lo tasimu karcha beineinechem lanes. That's the Hebrew. You are children of the Lord your God. Don't tear your flesh. Don't pull out your hair over a loss. What does that mean? Because you are children of God. Like many biblical verses, it's subject to multiple interpretations. One of the classic interpretations is a beautiful and simple one. And that is that indeed the person has just experienced loss. But desperation, the kind of desperation that expresses itself in the self-inflicted wounding as a result of the loss is when one feels they've lost everything. And what's critical is that we understand that even as there has been a very significant loss, a hole that has been created, a void that has now been opened, that will likely never really be filled, but we're not alone. There's still so much that we have. The Bible, the verse, tells us to think big and grand. Remember, one may have lost their father on earth, but we still have our Father in heaven. We are children of the Lord our God. We always have one who is out there, who cares for us, who looks out for us, who hears us, who we can communicate with, who we can unburden ourselves to, who will speak to us if we are attuned to be able to hear it. We lost something dear and something significant, but remember at the same time what we have. Remember at the same time what we still have. And in a great sense, while again, the verse has us aim high and see God's presence in our lives, and that we still have that, but we also gain that when we have community. When a person has sustained a loss, and what happens in the days afterwards is that they're not left alone. They're not left alone, but people come and they sit with that person. Sometimes they converse, and sometimes they just sit in silence. But it reminds us of what we still have. When a person feels bereft, they need to be able to see. There's a space, there's an emptiness, but there's so much that is still there. And that's the first fundamental treatment, so to speak, of grief that our tradition prescribes. Make sure that the person who grieves does not grieve alone. Make sure that they understand that whatever they've lost, there's still much that they have. The second element comes across in the conversation. So you spend a week speaking about someone who was in your life, who was so dear to you. Often when I sit with people who are in mourning, following the period of mourning, or as it's getting towards the end of the period of mourning, I ask them, tell me something. Let's say you're 50 years old, you're 60 years old, you're 40 years old, however old you are, you've had your parent in your life for all these years. Did you ever spend a week carrying on conversations about your father or your mother? Did you ever spend a day? Did you ever spend an hour? We don't do that. We don't do that about the people in our lives. Okay, occasionally they have a special birthday and we write a note for an album, to give them some kind of a message. Maybe if we're very expressive in our relationships, we'll write them a letter for their birthday or for some other special occasion, and we'll express. But you who are grieving, you may tell the person, what did you just do? You just spent hours for days talking about who that parent was. And yeah, I'm sure there's some stories about them that you repeated over and over and over again. But tell me something. Do you now have like a picture of what that person meant to you in your life? Understand that as they go through this process, because they're talking about the person and hearing about the person, about their loved one from the perspective of others to whom their parent or sibling or, heaven forbid, their child had a relationship, they're gaining a picture of what that person's life meant, about what they stood for, about what their values were. We can see our mother every single day. We can talk to her. We can have nice conversations. We can go shopping together. We can eat together. We can laugh together. We can bicker with one another. And we never really stop and identify who is she really? What is she about? What does she stand for? And this period of reflection about the loss, it can be painful, but it's incredibly, incredibly therapeutic, not just because of the catharsis of being able to get it off your chest, but what it really is it charts the course for a relationship that will now, in a certain sense, only begin. Because now, instead of just the relationship of physical contact and direct conversation, we now understand who that person was, the values that they stood for. We start to recognize those values in our own lives, the ones that are there and the ones that we will now pursue to make sure that we really want them to be there. I lost my own father, my own beloved father, several years ago. And though we lived many miles away from each other for the 35 years or so preceding his passing, I would speak to my father every day. From the time that international long distance became affordable, I would speak to my father, to my parents, every single day. And I visited, despite the fact that it was a transatlantic voyage, I visited him several times, my parents several times a year. But there's no question that today I feel closer to my father than I did when he was alive. because I spoke to him every day, and we talked about this, we talked about that, we talked about the other, and not just mundane matters, lofty things as well. He was someone who we talked about ideas, but we never talked about him, and I never thought about him in the fullest sense. But after sitting for a week with all those people coming, thinking about what my father meant, speaking about what my father meant to me, what it meant to them, there's a distillation in a certain sense of who he was, of what he stood for. And those values I now think about every day and carry with me every day. The way we face loss is not by denying it. We realize the whole that has been created. But we have two pieces. One piece is recognizing we've lost something, but let's think as well about what we still have. Not all is lost. We lost our father on earth. We have our father in heaven. We lost our father. We still have a support system. We're still here for each other. A community that is grieving, especially this year with the widespread grief of the pandemic, where people could have lost not just one, many people. It's so important for the support system that remains, for the surviving family members and surviving friends to be there so that the person does not feel ultimately bereft. And then that process, that thoughtful process about thinking about who was lost, talking about it, distilling the essence, the values, and using that as the first step for a continued relationship for the rest of life. We grieve when we think about a big empty space. I'll just conclude with an anecdote from my years in the active rabbinate, in the active clergy. I once had a very, very sad occasion to preside over a funeral of a beloved friend, a member of our community, who died after a short bout with brain cancer, and he had so much left in him, it seemed. And his mother was at the funeral. His mother was some 90 years old, and in the previous 2 or 3 years, she had lost 2 sons and her husband of almost 70 years. And I came to her and I said to her, Mrs., whatever her name was, I said, my heart goes out to you. So much, like what can you say? And she said, Rabbi, I'm not thinking about what I lost. I'm thinking about what I had. I'm thinking about what I had. And it was and will always be a tremendous gift. Human beings, we have tools for resilience. We have each other, and we have many tools within ourselves. We find them, God willing, we will be able to deal with the challenges that life brings us. Thank you for including me.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I love what you said. One of the things I wrote down, I think it sticks with me with the personal work that I do, which is community is what we need in order to grieve and grieve and the sense of loss, and the fact that the last story that you shared about one of your practitioner that came up to you, and the story of her feeling that angst and pain, but through that loss and grief, she gained something as well. So I agree with you. This is your talk and your share was so beautiful and profound, because it gives us a sense of connection, and human beings do need each other to grieve and cope with. So thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
The next speaker that we have on our panel, of course, is Don Trevino Salvador, and he is going to give us some of his introspection on the psychological work that he's doing within his community. Don Salvador, I know you're working a lot in the Latino communities, and you work a lot with multicultural communities. So please share with us today the loss that your community has gone through and how you're helping the practitioners in your community?
Yes, ma'am. I have a PowerPoint, a very brief PowerPoint presentation that I would like to share with the audience and with the group. So if you bear with me, I'm going to go here and start it off. I want to thank you. I want to thank the organization, the group, the American Muslim Health Professionals for inviting me. You have invited a group of very prominent individuals, and I feel very humbled to be walking among them. And I'm very grateful for that. I also want to make sure that I give a shout out to all the social workers who have helped me in my entire career, the public health workers, the intake workers, the paraprofessionals that see our patients between appointments to make sure that everything is okay between appointments. I want to make sure that I give a shout out and a thank you to all these individuals that have made my life and my professional career manageable. Without them, I would not be able to do the work that I do now. I want to briefly go over my presentation, and the PowerPoint presentation will be available for the audience if you choose to request it. I want to be talking about my theoretical knowledge base, where I get my ideas from. I want to be talking about my conceptualizations of loss, grief, and ritual. I'll also then turn into some very practical types of comments about culturally based interventions that will include catharsis, corrective emotional experience, insight, and ritual. And I will conclude with some remarks. I want to start off by saying that my theoretical knowledge base, my theoretical knowledge frame is primarily qualitative phenomenological and psychoanalytic. I am a psychoanalytically trained clinical psychologist. I'm also a trained marriage and family therapist. And I've been doing this for a little over 40 years, working primarily with Latino immigrants. I adhere to the basic principle that people are experts in their own lived experiences. If I want to know about depression, if I want to know how the pandemic has impacted my patient, I want to ask them directly, because I am a true believer that knowledge can be constructed by listening to people describe their lived experiences. I also hold the understanding that meanings of emotional experiences change over time. What was important for me before may not be important for me now. What was important for me before may not be important now. So the idea that there are multiplicity of meanings to human experiences and that they change over time is a construct, conceptualization that I adhere to. There are multiple truths, subjectivity, versus one universal truth to human experiences. In other words, we are layers of complexity, and I need to hold that idea that human experiences is really comprised of multiplicity of truths, not just one universal truth. I'm also an adherent to subjectivity, that subjectivity is just as important as objectivity in understanding my patient's lived experiences. As a psychologist, as a culturally competent psychologist, I try to hold a tension between evidence-based science, empirical science, Western ways of looking at things, and the qualitative descriptive science. And I'm yoking these two approaches, scientific approaches, together for me to facilitate a scientific frame of inquiry and understanding. The therapy that I do needs to be methodical. It needs to be, I need to be able to explain what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, why am I doing it, And how is that approach working out, Dr. T? The idea that in working with loss and grief, especially in the Latino community, there is a basic framework that I use in restoring the Latino soul in grief. Number one is I want to establish my professional credibility as a properly trained, knowledgeable, devoted practitioner of the healing arts. My patients need to see that I am in this discipline because it makes sense to me. This is my life's work. I need to accept that the Therapeutic Alliance is the true agent of change through positive regard, deep respect for your patients, and absolute fidelity to their subjectivity. The Therapeutic Alliance is really the medicine that promotes change in behavioral health. It's not the various theories of cognitive behavioral therapy or psychoanalysis. It's not the techniques that are born from these theories that bring about change. These theories that we hear, that we're taught, that we're trained in professional psychology are instruments of critical thinking. They do not promote the change. They are instruments of critical thinking that help the clinician, the psychologist, the healthcare worker focus their gaze on what to look for to help understand what the suffering is about. The other element of my basic framework is to be cognizant of having a shared worldview with my patients on matters of grief, matters of mourning, and of healing. I need to be familiar with the common expressions of grief that my patients bring to me in order for me to begin to build an understanding, a system of understanding. In addition to the points that I've said, a real important basic framework for me is to promote the idea that change is possible, and that's hope, beginning with supporting my patient's request for an appointment to see me. Key conceptualizations in the work that I do in my presentation today, soul refers to a person's genuineness and depth of lived experiences. Soul is psyche, psyche is soul. That's the root meaning of psyche is soul. Soul is the totality of our remembered and forgotten, repressed, lived experiences. Those memories, those that have been forgotten, continue to exert tremendous influence over our moods, over our self-esteem, over our identity. In addition, soul, as I'm using it in this presentation, it refers to what we feel when we are emotionally moved by divine beauty, by social injustice. My soul is what feels when I see the news and I see the social injustice. It is also what I feel when I see acts of kindness. Soul is what we feel emotionally when we feel emotionally moved. Soul is the I who cries in sorrow and mourns, el dolor y el luto. The root meaning of psychopathology is ailing soul, the soul in grief. The root meaning of therapy, therapia, is to breathe life, is to attend to. Thus, tending to the soul in grief is the work of psychotherapists who were originally referred to by Freud as doctors of soul. By loss and sorrow, what causes loss and sorrow? The death of a loved one. Isolation and loneliness brought on by coronavirus, brought on by social distancing, brought on by online learning. It's not children and teens are collectively grieving the loss of in-person school. Imagine what has been taken away for these children. Imagine the disruption to the social emotional development that play gives our children when they are in school. Loss and sorrow also refers to the loss of employment because of COVID-19 pandemic. The loss of employment was hit very, very hard, has been hardest hit by the communities of color, by the very people who work the fields, who pick our fruit and vegetables, those that wash our cars, those that clean our houses, those that clean after ourselves, those who serve us. They've lost employment. They've lost an ability to support their families. That is a significant loss. And especially for immigrants who make up most of this working class that cleans up after ourselves. Now, these immigrants are the ones that are being hit the hardest because of the pandemic. We are last in line and we are forced to wait. Loss and sorrow is also present in anhedonia and emotional flatlining as manifestations of the soul in grief. La alma en el dolor. Emotional flatness is what we see most often when referrals come into GCAPS around when the referrals are for children, referrals are for parents. There is an emotional flatlining, loss of interest. Loss is cumulative. It's not always observable. It can be intergenerationally transmitted. Grief, as I'm using this in this presentation, refers to the physical sensation of loss, of crying. For those of us who have experienced profound yearnings for someone that has passed away, and we love them so much that it feels like physical pain. Physical pain, el dolor, especially among men, denying loss, especially around men of color, where we don't talk about our depression and our sadness, but we're very, very, very good, ready to talk about our backaches, our asthma, our headaches, our stomach aches. Those we are okay with. Physical sensation, the grief, the loss, is often expressed in physical pain. Grief is also the result of deep emotional distress, of anxiety and depression, la pena, el duelo, the broken heart. Grief is also present in collective, intergenerational, historical harm that has been done to communities of color. We cannot deny that in Latin America, we are still feeling the reverberations of the conquest. After the Europeans came to the old world, the new world, as they called it, they brought illnesses, they brought brutality, they brought military might, that after the conquest, after 2 years, the entire continent was conquered. There was an increase in suicidality among the indigenous cultures, an increase in infanticide, an increase in deaths due to illnesses, the inability to fight off diseases. That loss, that significant trauma, that collective historical trauma, continues to be seen today in the proclivity, in the melancholy that we see in popular, traditional Mexican Latino music. You cannot ignore the intergenerational harm that is now being activated. Tears, the ethereal fluid that washes the soul, is what we see when our patients are grieving. El líquido etero que baña la alma, it cleansing tears, lágrimas de limpieza. Ritual, as I'm using it in this presentation, refers to a ceremony, observance, which, by the way, promotes healing. This is not a conceptualization that is, I'm just pulling out of my ears. Research backs this up, that rituals, daily rituals, strengthens our cultural identity with our ancestors through observance, through prayer, through storytelling. The countless stories that are told in the kitchen, in the living room, in the long drives on vacation. These are the stories that we hear about our ancestors, about our extended families, about the struggles of immigration, who's working, who's not working, who passed away, who didn't pass away. Stories of heroes, heroines, storytelling. Ritual creates and facilitates cultural identity and meaning through communal meals, dinner, music and song, movement, exercise, and other symbolic reenactments. Now, when we lose our capacity, when we lose our ability to connect ritual, to create ritual, we lose the loss of ritual promotes social alienation. This is what we are seeing as the social distancing interferes with our daily rituals. There is a loss of personal, religious, and spiritual meaning. It is a cultural disconnection. When we become symptomatic, from a disconnection from culture, from traditions, from the rituals that give our lives meaning. I want to say something real quickly about psychosocial stressors. We cannot deny those. We are having this webinar because of some significant psychosocial stressors that have been triggered by the pandemic. This photo was taken in San Antonio when my beautiful wife and I, Karen, went to visit the Alamo. This Texas Ranger that is standing next to me was very kind, good man, kind enough for him to agree to take a picture of me. He took a couple of steps back for him to protect the safety, as he says. I meant no disrespect, but I just need to stay back a little bit. Now, the idea that he needed to create some protective space is what captured this photo for me. These are not my patients that I see, but they could be. When I was doing face-to-face sessions, appointments, one of these would be my patient, but the entire extended family would come to my office. After a while, I just agreed to see them all. I started doing multiple family group therapy. The stressors, the tension in their faces, the child that's right in front of us, looking at the camera. Where are her thoughts? She looks exhausted. That's the image. That's the story of immigrants. This picture captures the relentless fatigue of moving. Right now, the world is experiencing the largest amount of people moving from one place to another because of climate change, because of socio-political persecution, because of religious persecution, because of abject poverty, because of cartel violence. The largest amount of people moving from one place to another. And whenever we move, whenever we leave our culture, our traditions behind to move to another culture, we leave behind the very things that give our life meaning. Imagine the loss. Imagine the loss of an entire community. Now we're talking about a collective grief, a collective loss. Stresses of immigration continue to be crossing the border, whether the border is down south, whether the border is in the Mediterranean. People are constantly trying to cross the border to get to the other side because what they're leaving behind is so perilous, so dangerous, that crossing the border, crossing the Mediterranean, crossing the countries in trains is worth it despite the peril. The stresses of immigration, coronavirus stresses, social isolation that cannot be ignored, in particular with cultures, sociocentric cultures, the Mediterranean cultures, African-American cultures, Latino cultures, Asian cultures, any of the cultures that emphasize the sociocentric nature of relating to people are hit hardest by social distancing. Because of the pandemic and the coronavirus has changed the way we educate our children. Loss of interest, loneliness, academic failure, loss of social emotional stimulation and development. That's big. That's big for children. Coronavirus has changed the way we worship. We celebrate marriage and birth, the way we grieve and mourn, the way we greet each other, the way we interact, the way we say goodbye to each other. All of that is based on tradition, is based on culture. It gives our life meaning. All of that has now been disrupted. What are some of the culturally informed interventions on a very practical level? What do you do with all of this? I facilitate catharsis, the expression, to grieve and to mourn. Mourning is the public display of grief. By allowing my patients to grieve, to be cathartic in their pain, in their suffering, I am facilitating a corrective emotional experience because I am helping them develop new meaning from their suffering. Now, this is transformative. This is healing. When we create new meanings, it allows for psychological and emotional expansion. I also try to promote insight. Insight is being able to recognize something new, something that you hadn't seen before. That's psychological growth. You need insight to move beyond complicated bereavement. Tell me your story. Because in you telling me your story and you telling me your narration, again, the healing is transformative because in telling me your story, you can control how the story ends. Spiritual and religious ritual creates meaning. It affirms meaning. It bears witness to loss. It is the balm to the soul in grief. By spirituality, I am referring to the idea, the belief in the acceptance that something in this universe is greater than I am. When I go to nature and I am at awe at what I am seeing, the vista of nature, that is my soul. That is a spiritual encounter. Saying good morning to people on a daily basis is ordinary spirituality. And this is what I teach my patients to do in recovering from the loss. Prayer, daily affirmations, support, and validate. It heals loss. The internalization of dramatic experiences linked to COVID-19 and social distancing may lead individuals and communities of people to become physically, emotionally, and psychologically ill and unable to grieve their cumulative losses. This may manifest as a loss of self-confidence, anhedonia, anxiety, substance abuse, domestic violence, conduct disorders, or school failure. And with that, that concludes my remarks.
Thank you so much, Don Trevino. Your presentation is so great. One of the things you wrote down, and I think I'm going to definitely use it and quote you on this, is you said tears are the ethereal fluid that washes the soul. I love that so much. I mean, it's beautiful and poetic, and your insight is so valuable to not only AMHP, but for all of us that are working in multicultural communities and circles. So thank you so much for your time and sharing some of your really vast knowledge. So thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming on our program today.
Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
you. The next person that I would like to introduce from our one of our wonderful panelists is Dr. Reverend, Dr. Leslie Copeland Toon. Dr. Toon, we are not able to see you yet, but please do share some of your insight with the communities that you're working with. And your resume itself speaks volume, and coming from, as a woman from a multicultural community, definitely value and thank you, and honored and privileged to have you on as well.
So much. I was moving some things around too for our time together. It's great to be here with you. I'm so grateful for the invitation from the American Muslim health professionals, and it is just great to be a part of this panel. So much has been said already, and it has really been very enriching. In my faith tradition, we sometimes will say, or open up a moment like this and say, this is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And I'm glad that we're gathering to talk about this. As I reflected at the end of 2020, as so many of us were just grateful to have made it through. And just looking back over the year, one of the things that occurred to me, we always talk about New Year's resolutions, and I thought about that. One of the things we'd like to leave behind, and I saw many social media posts and pontificating on this, but one of the things that we like to leave behind is some of the sadness and the grief of 2020. But one thing I am clear about is that there's no way to do that, right? That one of the things that we brought into 2021 and that we will have with us for some time is our grief and this sense of loss. I think of this in many ways, this past year in particular, with the coronavirus pandemic, as just this season of concentrated grief that has really been unimaginable in so many ways. And as we look at recovery, as we look at economic recovery, opening back up, as we look at life resuming as in some way, as we knew it before, I don't know that we'll go back to normal, and I don't know that we should go back to normal, that looking at how we're going to deal with grief and loss, I think is just really, really critical. It's been a concern of mine. I serve now, I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the National Council of Churches. I serve locally at Alfred Street Baptist Church as an associate minister. I've also served as the Minister of Congregational Life at Clifton Park Baptist Church, which is Silver Spring, Maryland. I live in the DC metro area, and I'm trained in pastoral counseling and care. And then I did additional training at my church to serve as one of the people on the ministerial counseling team. And I've also been involved in grief that we do at Alfred Street, surviving the holidays and that kind of thing. And so this has been part of just even my life's journey, and really knowing how grief can, it's something that needs to be attended to, is how I'll put it. That it's something that so many people try to look over it or dismiss it, but it is something that we should attend to, and in some ways, I want to say lean into, although I know that it's not easy for everybody to do that. I say that because when we think about it, as of today, there have been 591,812 people in the US have died from COVID. This doesn't include the number of people who have died from cancer or heart attacks or leukemia or diabetes or other illnesses, or just of natural causes. Today is Wednesday. Monday evening, I was in New York. My aunt died. She was 91 years old. And yet we gathered in a limited capacity. Some of my family was online to celebrate her life. So I come from a Baptist tradition. And more specifically, I should say, I come from a Black church tradition. And so we believe not only in having a funeral, but what we call a homegoing celebration, that the person who has died is going home in a Christian context to be with the Lord. And so while we know that we will miss them on earth, we also believe that they have a home in heaven, not made by human hands, and that we can celebrate that. And so part of our rituals have been interrupted, just like so many other things during coronavirus, because normally you would go, we also will visit people when someone has died. We take meals so the family doesn't have to worry about food or cooking. We'll sit with people, wash the dishes, or do whatever household chores to relieve the family that is grieving of some of that grief. We also will, at a homegoing celebration, you would go to the graveside with the family. You would have a repast that included however many people were able to attend, and you would feed people and fellowship and remember and tell stories about the person's loved one. And so much of that has been interrupted. So you have the grief, you have the loss that we've had by not being able to be together or to share together. You have the loss. Many people have lost jobs, so that's another loss. We've had this racial reckoning in the US. And for African Americans, it has been painful in many ways and traumatic to watch police shootings, we just marked the anniversary of George Floyd's death yesterday, to watch those videos and to see this. So there's all this trauma and grief kind of compacted together. And so I'm concerned about us not attending to it the way that we should, that we will try to get back to normal. We'll try to do some of the things that we would normally do. And we'll have these holes that we won't name or know how to name because we've just kind of rushed through it. I know even from my own experience, there was a period of time talking about concentrated grief in my family when my mom had 9 siblings. So in my family, one of my aunts got sick and actually died on Christmas Day. Another aunt was in the hospital while the other aunt was sick and died. So we couldn't even tell her that her sister had died. And she ended up not recovering. So my aunt died Christmas Day. My other aunt is still in the hospital and died in February. And in between, in January, my father had a stroke. So you can imagine that for my family, this was a very serious time of grief and loss and uncertainty. It just really turned us really upside down. And I think about that and how difficult it was. I remember being angry with God, and not even so much for myself, although I was very close to both of my aunts, but being angry because I felt like my mom is going through all of this and how is this supposed to happen? And the rabbi who was on talked about just the woman saying, remembering what you have. And what really began to comfort me was this understanding that I had been blessed to have these wonderful aunts who I was so close to, who I knew so much about, who were in my life and present in my life. And not everybody had that. So yes, it was a loss, but it was also a blessing to have had them in the first place. I wonder how, once we get back to normal, that when we get back to church, when we get back to the synagogue, when we get back to mosque, there will be people missing who we're accustomed to seeing. And I think we really should just find space and time to acknowledge that, to have moments of crying. I know a good cry every once in a while can cleanse your soul, and not being afraid to do that. Now, I don't like to do public displays of crying personally, but every once in a while, if it is, if something is happening that's very, that the moment calls for tears, I think that it is fine to cry, and we should make space and room in those moments for us to do just that. When an uncle of mine died, someone shared with me and said, grief cannot be rushed. Grief cannot be rushed. And I have really held on to that through the years. In 2012, my own father died, not from complications from the stroke. He ended up having leukemia, but he had been diagnosed with this disease, and they gave him 3 years to live, and he lived 18 years after they had diagnosed that he would die. So part of the grief was, you know, he always bounces back, you know, and you have that expectation. And so I mentioned that only to say that whether it's a surprise, sudden, like it has been with so many with COVID, or whether it's someone who has been sick for a long time, regardless of how that is, grief can still strike you and hit you in ways that you may be unexpected, that you may, and you may not even know when it's going to strike. I used to do grocery shopping for my father, and after he died, particularly on Sundays, and after he died, I remember one Sunday being in the grocery store and just in an aisle and overwhelmed with grief and did not see it coming. And so I was gentle with myself and I just said, you know what, it is what it is. And I let myself cry publicly in the grocery store. A few people gave me some strange looks, but I let myself do it because sometimes, you know, you have to let the grief work itself through your system, I believe. I think it's natural, and even from a Christian perspective, holy to miss people who have been a blessing in your life and who have loved you and who you have loved. And so to act as if that's not there, I think doesn't really honor the relationship, or it doesn't help you in having your own healing process. So I would just say that allowing the space and the time for grief, recognizing that grief cannot be rushed. You know, there's some trains of thought in some Christian circles where people feel like if you cry or if you show grief that you're not honoring God because, you know, God is still with you and you still are, you still have God in your life. And so different ways of looking at that. I would say, particularly from my tradition, from a Christian perspective, Jesus wept, right? When Lazarus, who was his friend, died, he wept because it was his friend and his friend had died, right? And so I think just honoring and knowing that that is okay, that when somebody has been a blessing in your life, when somebody has been a friend, when somebody has been a family member who is no longer there, a church member who is no longer there, for us to show that we are missing that person, to remember them again with story and with even with our tears and with gathering in different spaces and places to remember them, I think honors them and honors their life. I do agree that grief is spiritual. I think that has been said and lifted up. Excuse me. And I also think it's important, excuse me, for us to get help if we need it. That there are people who are trained counselors. There's groups that, like Grief Share is one that is very focused on Christians, but Grief Share, oh, excuse me, and others like it are tools that we can use as we're grieving and going through the grieving process. So I think, you know, there's so much that we could say and so much that could be said about this whole thing. I guess I just really want to emphasize that we really should attend to this grief, that we shouldn't be ashamed of, you know, the fact that we feel sad that someone is no longer there, or that we've had these other losses, that we recognize and acknowledge them and work toward processing it the best way we can in community, and that we really move toward healing. I said earlier, excuse me, and I will just repeat that, you know, when you don't attend to grief, grief attends to you, right? And so that there's this way that when you don't acknowledge it, when you're not attending to it, it can, I've seen it, it can come back to be like a monster. And there are times I have journeyed with people who, you know, their mother may have died like in the 80s, and you have a conversation with them today, and they are almost back in that moment because they haven't really grieved well and they haven't had this space for grief. And it's hard for them to get over because of that. So I just hope as we are doing ministry and leading in so many different areas of life, that we will really attend to and make sure that we're encouraging others to attend to their grief, so that we can really, when we are over the pandemic and we're back, that we really can be healthier as a nation of people. And that we have so many things that need attention, but I think we do it better, and we do it in much healthier ways when we have attended to the grief and loss that we have. And I will also just say very quickly as I wrap up, because I'm looking at the time, but that, you know, there's so many times when people can be a challenge to deal with. I'm trying to say that gently. Or they can be difficult, or they can be rude. And sometimes those people who are doing those things, they're dealing with grief and they're not attending to it properly, right? And so sometimes they can come, you know, they can be rude to you and you're thinking, well, what did I do to them? But really there's so much other emotion attached to how that interaction is going. So particularly as we come out of this pandemic, as we've had so much on us this last year and a half almost now, that we really are, I'll use the word gentle, because I think that's a great word, gentle with one another, that we're gentle with ourselves, that we give people a pass sometimes when we might not have normally given them a pass, and that we try to really encourage one another to grieve well together so we can get through this and get to the other side of it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Copeland Toon. That was really introspective, and thank you for sharing your vulnerability. You know, and I really liked what you said, that if we don't attend to our grief will attend to us. So I think that is something that is a powerful message, Dr. Toon. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us and your vulnerability and your family's experiences. And it certainly is very insightful for all of us to know, though. So thank you for sharing your journey with us. And our last panelist on the group that joined us is Dr. Imam Muhammad Majid. He's the executive Imam of the All Dulles Area Muslim Society in Sterling, Virginia, the Adams Mosque. And Dr. Imam Majid is also a co-author of 3 different books. He's also done a lot of community work with think tanks that also prevent violence in the communities. Dr. Majid, Imam Majid, thank you for joining us today. Please share with us your insight in what your communities are going through and how they're dealing with their grief and loss.
Thank you so much. You know, I like the title doctor, but I'm not a doctor. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thank
you for joining us, Imam Majid.
Yes, I was given a doctor actually degree when I was on to Sudan with the Medical Association, American Muslim Association, and they gave me like a certificate, said I'm a doctor. But anyway, that's a joke. But I really am very inspired to hear the panels before me to talk about what happened in the community. And I really want to thank you, Abida, and the Muslim professionals for holding this very, very important discussions, very timely. I want to say that mental health in many cultures is a taboo. People don't talk about mental health, including regarding grieving. When people grieve about the loss of loved one, they tend to dismiss the mental health aspect of it and take a toll on people, especially issue of depressions and that come after losing loved one. And sometimes the imam and the religious leader have to understand that our limitation. And I like what the pastor was saying, you know, relating to the people who are really suffering and recommend for them to seek professional help. I just want to say that this pandemic have changed so much of the nature of our services to our community. I have not attended many funerals that I would have attended, including people who have died of COVID because of restrictions at the time. And many times that people do Zoom, condolences. And there's a tradition in the Muslim community of something called Quran Khani, which is reciting the Holy Quran for the soul of the person who passed away. But that itself was a social gathering that bring comfort to people. But because of COVID, people couldn't do that in person. Therefore, there's a lot of things to be said about this issue, that how this have transformed and changed the community. And I do believe that the impact of COVID will be felt for years to come. And people maybe will be processing the loss of a loved one that they couldn't see at the hospital. They only have to talk to them over the phone because of the limitation of visitation at the time. And maybe they couldn't wash the body of someone who passed away. They couldn't kiss them in the forehead, goodbye. That will be with people for a long, long time. And therefore, the way I'm relating to people who have lost their loved one during COVID-19, not some of them I see them in person, and some of them I already, talk to them on the phone, but seeing them in the person was completely different, because as if they realized that there was something missing, that I was not there for the funeral, or they were not there beside their loved one when they're dying, and they couldn't themselves be there for their loved one. It's just a different feeling, that just unspoken, a kind of interaction that, like, I tried to say to them, I feel your pain, but you cannot really feel the people's pain completely. It would be a lie if I tell them how you feel. We're being trained as counselor not to say that. Don't say to the person, I know how you feel. You can try to relate to them, through the spiritual healing, and try to relate to them the teaching of your faith, of your religion, of the scriptures and so forth at this time. Few things I just want to share that I learned through this process. Number one, it's okay for people to become in denial in the beginning, and then to be angry is fine. Many people think that Islamically it's not right to be angry. It's absolutely right to be angry. And matter of fact, Moses, the prophet Moses, peace be upon him, when he was, God called him, and maybe my friend from the Jewish community can relate to that story, with some of the elite of children of Israel, and then they died. And then he said to God, I can't go back and say that all the people with me have died. I want them back. And God resurrected them, actually, for Moses, because he was worried about even how to can relate this information or this news to people. Therefore, it's okay. A woman was standing at the grave of her husband, and the prophet, peace be upon him, passed by her, and she was crying and so forth. They tried to give her comfort. She said, leave me alone. You don't know what happened to me. And the prophet did not scold this woman, did not say, well, how come she talked to me like that? He left her. And she said, okay, because sometimes you need to give people their space. People might not want us to lecture them. They don't want us to tell them, even what God going to give them in next life. They don't want to hear that. They just want you to listen to them. They want to cry. They want you to comfort them the way they want to be comforted. But it's okay for sometimes we as a clergy to give people the space, especially during burial, that people sometimes try to comfort people in a way that they're not ready to be comforted. And therefore I, tell the community, give people their space, don't lecture them. And then you validate people, feeling. There's a lot of in the scripture in the Holy Quran talk about the grieving of Joseph, father, Jacob, call him Yaqub in Arabic, but Jacob in English, where he was crying about missing his son, Joseph, Yusuf. I cried until his eyes become blind, actually. He lost his sight. That is intense grief. And then when his children said, why are you so crying so much? He said, I'm complaining to God. I'm just talking to God. I'm telling God my pain. It's okay to talk to God like that. You have Mary, the mother of Jesus, was worried and was saddened to what to tell people, because she's gonna lose the respect, the community, bringing a child. And she said to God, I wish I was dead before this. I wish I was not, alive. And she said that to God. It's okay to hear the story of mother of Moses. She was so grieving about the separation between her and her child, and the Quran talks about that grief. And then the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, loss of his own wife and lost his children and so forth. There's a lot in the scriptures, a lot in the literature in Islam talk about grief, how the prophets, righteous people, dealt with grief. I want to say that in this process, there are three elements: the spiritual element, where to give person comfort that it's okay to cry, it is okay, to express your sadness. It's okay to even to be in denial. Like one of the Muslim leaders after the Prophet died, he denied that the Prophet have died, and then he became angry. His name Umar. He became angry that he's, how comes he have died and so forth. And then he was reminded gently about the even the Prophet can die. My point is this: in this process, that we have to meet people where they are. Meet them where they are. A very crucial things in grieving process and helping people meet them where they are. The other aspect of this is to understand the psychological aspect of grieving, not only the spiritual aspect of it. Because when people do sometimes, they said, okay, just you need to read your holy book, you'll be okay. That is really a spiritual aspect of it. Give comfort, it's true. But there's psychological aspect, when the depression hits, when people withdraw from life and we don't see them anymore in the mosque, when you don't hear from them anymore, that you need to check on them. Even in the time of COVID, we said to people, just call people, Zoom, ask about them to see if they need any help, and at the same time give them their space, but ask them to say, I want to tell me, what do you want from me? How can I help you? As you heard that maybe there's a statement, treat people the way you want to be treated. I don't believe in that. I would say treat people the way they want to be treated. Ask them how they want to be treated. Don't treat them the way you want to be treated. Ask them how they want to be treated, how they want to be helped at this time. Therefore, also, I want to talk about the support system. In Islam, the Prophet, peace be upon him, when his cousin died, he asked people to cook for them. And I like the culture that the pastor was talking about, cooking for people, serving them, because when they're grieving, they don't have time to take care of themselves and take care of their family. But at the same time, ask them if that is something they don't want. The last things I want to say, I don't know how much time I have, and I forgot how much time I have, but I'm not going to speak too long. The idea of comforting children. We do have way of dealing with adult, but many people don't realize that children need grief counseling. And this is one of the most difficult things for me to do, how to explain death to children and how to comfort them from a spiritual perspective. You see a child 7 years old, 8 years old, they lost a loved one, and because of COVID, people couldn't be with them. Then you see them the first time in the mosque after we open the mosque. What do you tell that child? How do you comfort them? And the parents asking me, and maybe the single mother now asking me, I have difficult to explain to my children the death of their father, and please, I want you to help me. Therefore, sometimes I get on Zoom with them try to explain to them and comfort them and listening to them. One of the most important things in grieving is listening. Just listen and listen and listen. I think that is one of the most important aspect of it. And then connect the loss to something positive. People do want to do something in the memory of their loved one. They want to serve. Sometimes they ask you to facilitate that in the mosque, or maybe a mosque in the synagogue or the church. How can I keep the memory of my loved one alive in this community? How I make sure that people don't forget about them, and therefore facilitate that for them. It may be do some volunteering activities in their name. Maybe they wanted to themselves to have a symbol, in their home, right, regarding this person's memory, and therefore that is one of the aspects that I think we need to think about. And then we have to think about cultural issues, because I'm from a community that have multicultural aspect of it, and therefore meet people where they are, also in their culture, because people grieve differently in different culture. For just don't pass judgment on people, and allow them to express how they want to deal with their sadness and the loss of loved one. I just wanted to not to speak too long, to allow you, if you have any follow-up you want me to talk about, but that's what in general, I give this talk in 1.5 hours in breaking down grieving and so forth. But, Imam, if they give the Imam a microphone, you might be here for next day. Before I would just stop here.
Thank you so much, Imam Majid. We appreciate your time, but thank you for that also. And mashallah, one of the things that I know is always very meaningful to all of us is humor can also help a lot of us get through grief. So we certainly appreciate that. Imam Majid, I really like what you said is meeting people where they are, because when they grieve, different community members grieve very, very differently. So the fact that we need to meet people where they are. Before we wrap up today, I definitely want to emphasize that one of the things that I learned from all of our wonderful panelists tonight was what I hear as a therapist often, which a lot of us don't get the honor and privilege to do at times. And even from a professional lens, we forget that people do heal differently, and we do heal in very, very different ways. And coming from a multicultural community, I think one thing that resonated with me tonight was the fact that all of you mentioned in your own ways, empathy. And I think empathy is something that will help all of us going through grief and loss during the pandemic, as well as helping each of our communities get through this loss through empathy. And certainly collectively, I think those are two big messages that I think I heard from all of you sharing today, was empathy, and collectively through our communities that we can help all of our members, as many as we can at least, to get through their own loss, and helping them through those grieving processes. So I want to thank everyone tonight that joined us, our wonderful panelists, Rabbi Moshe Hauer, and of course, Dr. or Don Salvador Torvin, Dr. Leslie, Reverend, Dr. Reverend Leslie Copeland Toon, thank you so much. And of course, Imam Majid, Muhammad Majid. Thank you, Imam Majid, for your time tonight, and for all of you for joining us. And I learned so much from all of you tonight, and I definitely took notes that I want to share with my own therapy clients and patients. So thank you all so much for your time. I'm from Texas, so you're going to hear me say a lot of y'alls anytime they're on this panel. So I certainly am happy to have you, every one of you all tonight. So thank you so much, and each of you a good night.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you.